be alive in this land of ours. Good to drive in this land of ours.
Hello, Canada hockey fans in the United States.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hockey Time Machine. I'm Glenn Dreyfus. 25 years ago next month, the Whalers played their final game in Hartford. No one would have predicted then that the Whalers would be the Van Gogh of sports franchises. Underappreciated then, beloved now. Later on, we'll hear from Whalers founding owner Howard Baldwin, and in just a couple of minutes, the guy who saw Hartford's NHL years from beginning to end, Chuck Caton. But we begin with the man who wrote the book on the franchise. Pat Pickens is the author of The Whalers, The Rise, Fall, and Enduring Mystique of New England's second greatest NHL franchise. Pat, thank you very much for joining us.
Always happy to be here, Glenn. Thanks for having me.
In the book, you describe the Hurricanes' 2006 Stanley Cup parade if it had happened in Hartford and not Raleigh, North Carolina. I mean, Pat, why? Why did you have to rip the heart out of the Hartford fans reading this book right from the very beginning?
Yeah, right from the opening face off of the book, huh? Yeah, no, I think it was important to imagine that because, the irony is there was a parade in Hartford, and it was happened in 1986 after the Whalers fell just short of qualifying for the conference finals. So the city threw the team a parade, but I think what was remarkable is just sort of, I think it was just the imagery of it. It just sort of to take people back to the fact that here was this also ran team that sort of, like you referred to it as, sort of not beloved when they existed, not really, they were sort of, they were there. And then to sort of, see how they've come all these years later. But then also sort of to imagine it, because you mentioned, the franchise did win a championship, and there aren't too many organizations that leave their former homes and then win a championship that quickly. It was 9 years from when they moved out to when there was the Stanley Cup, the only championship still in franchise history. And I think to bring forth the imagery and to bring forth to just sort of imagine, this if things had been a little bit different, this would have happened in Hartford. This very well could have and perhaps should have happened in Hartford instead of the parade that happened in Raleigh, North Carolina. So I think it was, again, to sort of, it was one of those things that I really wanted to start with that imagery because, again, no one would have ever thought of a parade in Hartford for a championship because they only threw the one parade when it was after the second round. And yet here we are in 2006, the franchise won the championship. And I thought it was a good way to start to sort of imagine if that team had a few breaks here and there and changed, maybe it would have happened in Hartford.
Pat, we're going to beg your indulgence. Stand by for just a minute because we want to interrupt to bring in a Hall of Famer. We are honored to be joined by, as we said, a Hockey Hall of Famer and a former Whaler, Mark Howe. And Mark, I know how busy you are, so thank you for making a few minutes for us.
Oh, no, glad to, Glenn. So, it's always fun to talk about the Whale.
So to start, what brought the Howe family from Houston to Hartford?
Well, it's quite simple. Two people, Howard Baldwin and my mother. They got together and And the best thing about it, as you look back, was Howard. By the Whalers signing the family, it gave Gordy a chance to continue his career on the ice. So Dad ended up getting 3 more years out of his career, and for me, it was 3 more years of opportunity and playing on his wing for a couple of years. So it was a huge bonus for me as well.
Because the story was supposedly the Boston Bruins were after you, right? So what tipped the scales toward the Whalers?
Uh, Being able to have Dad on the ice. So I know as a young kid growing up, everybody dreams of playing in the National Hockey League and winning the Stanley Cup. I mean, there's no bigger goal than that if you're a hockey player. And that was my dream. I wanted to get to the NHL. I had Dad retired. Chances are I might have been a Boston Bruin. Boston actually gave me a really good 5-year offer. Harry sent it. I spoke with Harry a number of times. But I said, it's not going to be on my resume that I was the reason Gordie Howe retired. So, but no, you look back and, I've been very fortunate with all the wonderful things that happened to me over my career, people I met, places I played, wonderful owners. But there's no memory that comes close to playing on the same team as my father. And like I said, Dad either played center or right wing, and I was the left winger on his line. And I benefited for 6 years before I became a defenseman. And so it gave me 3 more years of playing on the same team with arguably the greatest hockey player in the world.
And your mom, as you mentioned, quite the negotiator, wasn't she?
Oh yeah, she was. So and Mom was all about family, and I remember I was in my townhome in Houston when the negotiations were going on when we were leaving the Arrows, and I expressed my opinion of wanting to go to the NHL and wanting to be able to compete for a Stanley Cup. And I was still a young age of 22. She said, "You're going to get your chance." She said, "It's going to happen, but you're not going to have an opportunity to continue the history of what we had done down in Houston, playing on the same line with your father." And that was it. Once she put that into my head, I said, "Yeah, without a doubt, you're correct. You're right." So we'll let the other stuff be on hold for a while. But I said, I think with a lot of people, I know with myself, the older you get, you have a different perspective of things on life. And without a doubt, that was by far the best decision I ever made. And we've always been about family. That's how my mother and father brought us all up. I think it would have been extremely selfish of me that had I left and only looked after my own needs and wants and gone to Boston. So and Hartford was great. I spent 5 years there. It's a beautiful community. Took pride in playing for the team, and things changed. You moved on, but yeah, like I said, I got plus it gave me a couple more years with my brother Marty. But a lot of brothers play together with us. We played together every year since I was like 4. It's only 1 year we didn't play together till I was like 25 or 26. So yeah, it gave me a couple more years with Marty as well.
Well, your decision is rewarded a couple of years later in an additional way because Hartford joins the NHL, and you and your dad and Marty for a few games as well, you all get to play together with the Whalers in the National Hockey League. So how much did that all mean to you and to your dad especially?
I don't know. Just for Dad, just to like I said, he turned 52 years of age that year, and I think he still had 37 or 38 points. And I always said Nick Futillo, I think, had 10 goals playing on Dad's left wing, so that's how good Gordie Howe was at the age of 52. But no, Dad just loved to play. He loved the game. He loved everything about it, and so he got to continue his dream there. And for me, merging into the NHL is. I finally got to where I wanted to be. The 4 teams survived the WHA and got in. And, in Hartford, we only lost 1 or 2 players, I think, in the expansion draft or in the draft. But I really felt bad for Edmonton and especially Winnipeg because Winnipeg was a heck of a team. I think they ended up losing 9 or 10 players in the draft. They went back to the NHL teams that owned their rights. So and actually, so once it came out of the whole deal, I think the Whalers were probably the best team of the 4 that got into the NHL that year. Only I think mostly by default.
Now about Mark Howe. You had a bunch of hat tricks in the WHA, but your one and only NHL hat trick came in a Whalers sweater. It was opening night, 1980, in St. Louis. What do you remember about that game?
Well, as an old WHA goalie, Mike Liut, they gave it to me. So yeah, my timing was bad. I had a couple of hat tricks during exhibition season, but what I remember the most about that game, I know I had 3 goals. I think I had two assists, but what I remember the most is we lost. We lost, I think it was 6-5. And that's what the game's about. It's not about individual stats. It's about winning and losing. And, we had some good hockey players on that team. Blaine Stout was a heck of a sniper, great goal scorer. Mike Rogers was a big time player. And, we had a lot of guys that chipped in. It gave me the chance to, like I said, we had Gordie Howe, we had Dave Keon, we had Johnny McKenzie. I think at the end of the year we added Bobby Hull. I don't know if it was that year or the year after. And wow, what an opportunity to play on the same team with those guys as well. And, as a young kid, those are the people I looked up to. And now you're in the same locker room. You're out sweating together and stuff. And so, yeah, Hartford provided a lot of great opportunities for me.
Well, for the record, that wasn't just any old hat trick. 2 things about it. One, you scored all 3 goals in the same period, the second period. And 2 of those 3 goals you scored shorthanded. So that was quite a notable accomplishment.
Yeah, I don't know. I was used to scoring shorthanded goals. I don't know. I know in Philly, I think I had 8 or 9 or whatever one year. And I remember in the old WHA, we were playing against Indianapolis, and I think I had 2 goals, and I hit the post all in the same penalty kill. So I almost had a hat trick shorthanded. So, yeah, even though I always thought the game mostly defensive, but I knew when the opportunity was to try to create offense. And every once in a while, if the team's on a power play, the odd guy tends to relax a little bit, which gives you a little bit more opportunity to provide offense. So, but like I said, the biggest memory, the thing I remember the most is we lost that hockey game. So that's when you have a great individual night, it's just a lot more rewarding if your team wins.
You mentioned the Flyers, and unfortunately, the Whalers have a history of not so good trades. And one of the not so goodest was sending you to Philadelphia. I mean, good for you. You had 10 great years there. Good for the Flyers. Not so good for the Whalers.
I don't know. It was when we first went to Hartford. I had a note. My mom had negotiated no trade contracts, and things changed over time. So Dad had retired. Marty was being switched back and forth between the minors. Actually, he was out on loan to the Boston Bruins one year, just so the Whalers could save a little money. And then with me, actually, I think the best year I ever had in my hockey career was year 2 of the merger. I was in the top 10 in scoring, and the team was in 8th place, 9th place overall in the league. All things were going, and then I had a horrible injury. I went into the net and I got skewered, and that changed basically my life. It changed the direction of my career. When I came back, and so the night I got hurt, I remember I weighed in. I was 192 pounds that night. When I tried to play a game 6 weeks later, actually we played against Philadelphia in Philly, I was 171 pounds, weak as a noodle. And, things weren't back then what they are now. I would have never been allowed to play different thing. But as most athletes, you want to get back, you want to help your team. And so what happened, I think within a year's time, and I wasn't happy with my play. I know I wasn't playing very well, but I was trying. But the coaches and some of the management people at that time were disgruntled. They they didn't agree with my assessment of how I was, and I was still only 178 pounds the next season, and they had a Canada Cup that year. I went and played up in Montreal for the USA, and I was terrible. I was so bad they had me on left wing for a while, and I came back, and it wasn't until the end of that next year that I started to feel better. But by then, bad feelings had happened between, like I said, some of the management, and then Howard tried to step in, try to help out, and I didn't like the way Marty was being handled. So I mean, that's the negative thing about playing with a family member. And with me, I went in. I more or less kind of forced their hand. I asked for a trade. They said they wouldn't trade me. I said, no, you'll trade me. And it was time. I think had I not had that injury, I probably still would have been a Whaler. But things, fate changed things, and I was able to go to Philadelphia, and I guess people looked at me differently when I got to Philly, and I was still under the Gordie Howe name, I think in the Hartford area. But once I got to Philly, they just looked at me as a player. They looked at me as Mark Howe, and so I think I got looked at a little differently as well.
Let me ask you lastly about when you were inducted into the Hall of Fame, and there's a really sweet moment when your dad gets to see you put on a certain sweater. Will you tell me about that moment and what you remember about it?
Yeah, that's easy. Yeah, so like during my induction to the Hall of Fame, obviously you don't get there without so much help from so many people. And for me, like without a doubt, there's no way in the world I'd ever be in the Hockey Hall of Fame had it not been for all the things my mother did, especially when I was younger. Marty and I would probably never played. I mean, all the hours she put in and stuff, but Mom had already passed and Dad was there. And so I spent the last 3 years of my career playing in Detroit. And anybody knew Gordie. Gordie never asked for a thing ever. But I think it was about 6 weeks after I retired, he said to me, he said, "Man, I wish you would have worn my jersey one day." And I'm like, "Oh my God, Dad, it's a little bit late now." And then I think it was 16 years later, I got into the Hockey Hall of Fame. And by far, even the easiest and the first thought that came to my head was, I'm going to get a chance to, do what Gordie had one of his wishes. So, so I went out. I bought a Red Wing jersey with the number 9 on it, and I saved it for that day. And I figured, to me, that was by far the best tribute I could give my father. So he carried me along on his left wing. Like I said, for 6 years. So, but yeah, like I said, it's. Like I always teach my kids, it's not about you. So it wasn't about me. It was about my teammates, my coaches, the organizations, but most of all, it's about my family. And like I said, I wanted to make sure I gave my mom her due respect. And obviously the best thing I could do is my father's put on that jersey and shake his hand. It was a great moment.
Mark, it's been a great moment for us that you made time for us. We kept you longer than we promised we would. I really do appreciate that you did make time for us this evening. Thank you.
No, glad to help out, Glenn. So and for Pat and for Chuck and Howard, please say hello and enjoy the chat. And I got to tell you too. So Marty and I rode in the NHL. At the Macy's parade years ago on their float, and they were debating what they wanted us to wear. So they had me wear a Flyers hoodie, and they were trying to get Marty to wear something. Well, Marty put on the Hartford Whaler, the old Hartford Whaler hoodie, and all through New York City. I'll guarantee I got a lot of booze. Marty got so many cheers and applause and everything for his uniform and those colors. I mean, it's still so popular to this day.
Okay, so you have to indulge me for one more question.
Yeah.
Pat calls it the Whalers mystique. 25 years later, can you explain it?
No, I can't. I mean, I wish I could, but Hey, I like the colors too. I mean, the uniform was cool, was awesome. The city was good, but I don't know. Maybe it's because they had something and they let it get away. Maybe that's the mystique of it all. If it was still there, I don't I don't know if it would be that popular, but it's one of those things that, hey, I had it, and maybe it didn't work out right, and it got away from me. Maybe that's what it is.
Very good. As good as explanation as any.
Yeah, no, it's worth a shot in the dark. So what the heck?
Thank you, Mark, very much. We appreciate your time.
Okay, Glenn, you too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. If we can bring Pat Pickens back in and thank him for standing by. Pat, thank you for letting us squeeze Mark Howe in ahead of you.
Are you kidding? I would have stayed for 20 more minutes of that if had be. You know, it's like I got to talk to Mark Howe, and it was honestly, I think, you know, one of the greatest I would say treats of this entire book is listening to Gordie Howe stories, and no one knows more Gordie Howe stories certainly than Mark. So I think that was a real treat. I was just sitting back here, you know, laughing at, you know, just awestruck by listening to Mark Howe talk. I always love listening to him talk.
It is so great that a Hall of Famer like that, yet he makes time for us on a program like this and time for the book. We're very much indebted. But along with the mystique, you also talk about the rise of the Whalers. Let's talk about that first. The Whalers joined the WHA in 1972, and it's really a magical first season.
Yeah, it was remarkable because what turned me onto this story that a lot of people didn't necessarily know was there's a really impressive or incredible narrative arc in the history of the Whalers. Like you said, with that first season, you know, they sort of catch lightning in a bottle. They have, you know, Jack Kelly running the program, and they're splitting their games between Boston Garden and Matthews Arena, and Howard Baldwin talks about how, you know, they were the first in everything. They won their division, they won the championship, they were first in revenue, they were first in attendance, and they thought that the good days would continue to ride forever. And it was a matter of, you know, they had some really incredible, you know, Larry Plow had a hat trick in the championship game, and it was a game on national TV, and you know, they were, but the funny thing is that they're playing in Boston. So few people realize, you know, the history of the Whalers started in Boston, and they're playing, you know, essentially fourth fiddle behind obviously the Bruins, who were, you know, Stanley Cup contenders in the early '70s, great teams with obviously Bobby Orr and Phil Esposito and some of the all-time greats, and, you know, Jerry Cheevers at goal, who actually wrote the foreword for the book. So, and they're behind, you know, the Boston Braves, and they're behind the Celtics, obviously, and they're behind the Circus, which is, you know, outdraws the Whalers in that first year too, or in those, you know, with those first few days in Boston, and yet they're persevering, and you know, the fact that they were a championship team in that first year was pretty incredible, because they you know, so I guess somebody had to be, but you know, their entrance into the WHA was sort of, you know, they weren't certainly on the first in line. Certainly their ownership group was not the first in line to get a team, as it pertains to, you know, who they were, and you know, Howard Baldwin, people might know who he is now, but, you know, they didn't know him necessarily. I mean, they had known him through his work with the Flyers organization and with Ed Snyder to some degree, but you know, it was a magical first year, and I think Howard talks often about how he didn't appreciate it, which is, to me, is pretty remarkable. You know, you look back at it, it's just sort of one of those things that you have this exceptional year in your first year. I think he said it was like winning the Oscar on his first film. You didn't necessarily appreciate it or understand what it meant until you get, you know, their run through the WHA, where they were a playoff team every year, and they had these sort of premature exits. But that first year they won the whole thing.
Well, staying with the WHA years, as you mentioned, the team relocates to Hartford, and then the roof caves in.
Yes.
Literally.
Yes.
That was a curse, but strangely, in a way, it turned out to also be kind of a blessing.
Yeah, I think that was one of the crazy things to learn from talking to Howard Baldwin was, you know, to tell the whole story was, you know, January of 1978, and and the Whalers were out of town. There was a basketball game. UConn played UMass the night before, and at 4:19 a.m. overnight, that the roof collapsed, and fortunately there was nobody in there, nobody injured, nobody killed, fortunately. And I talked to Mike Rogers, and to hear him talk about how, and to get the sense of how fearful he was, away from the team. I think they were in Western Canada, and while the All-Star game was also going on, it was just to sort of give you a sense of what the WHA what was happening there. It was this fear, because the WHA was this wild west of leagues where teams folded mid-season. They would move mid-season. Nothing was really, it sounds so unique when you think about where we are in 2022 with how established and buttoned up and first class all of these organizations were. And yet you think about maverick leagues like the AFL and WHA and the ABA, and that it wouldn't have been unheard of. Wouldn't have been. No, I don't think too many people would have batted an eye if the Whalers said, okay, our building collapsed, we're going to close up shop. And yet, Howard springs to action. He gets them the building in Springfield. They had played about a year and a half in Springfield while the Civic Center was being completed on their way from Boston to Hartford. And the corporate community in Hartford realized the importance of the Whalers and what it did for the self-esteem, and also sort of tourism dollars, and sort of could see that the NHL was on the horizon potentially. And Howard tells it, and it's remarkable to me to learn that Hartford wouldn't have had an NHL caliber building if not for the roof collapse, because 10,507 seats was the capacity of the Hartford Civic Center as it was built, as it was opened in 1975. And the roof collapse mandated upgrades. And again, the corporate community, Hartford's big industry is insurance. So there were people at Aetna, people at Cigna, people at really high profile insurance industry who said, people like Don Conrad, who later became a partial owner of the team. And to the point where he said, we're going to fund this renovation, and we're going to add 5,000 seats, and we're going to add luxury boxes, and we're going to give you this state-of-the-art pristine roof that will never collapse under the weight of ice and snow and New England weather again. And again, the team moves to Springfield and plays, into the NHL days even, and they get fan support. People talk about the lack of fan support in terms of the Whalers, and about how there was indifference or ambivalence in the region. And yet here were these people, they call it the I-91 Club, because there were hundreds of people who would go, 30 miles. The 30 miles is not that far, but to go 30 miles up the road to Springfield, Massachusetts to support the New England Whalers, it was a big deal. And again, that was that moment could have been, spelled the end of the franchise. And yet it was the catalyst for them ultimately, getting acceptance into the NHL with a 15,000 seat arena comparable with the other NHL rinks at the time.
Very, very good stuff, Pat. We're going to ask your indulgence to stand by once more, then we'll bring you back in a few minutes. But right now, we want to welcome in a man who has a plaque in the broadcasting wing of the Hockey Hall of Fame, Chuck Caton. And the reason why he's a Hall of Famer can be summed up in one audio clip. So, Chuck, before we have you speak, we want you to listen to this, the dying seconds of overtime of a Whalers game in Minnesota. And everybody listen to how beautifully Chuck prepares his listeners for what might happen. And then it does.
It's off to the right of John Casey, so the Whalers will get the last chance to win the game in basketball fashion. 4.4 seconds is an eternity in this game. There was enough time last night for Falloon, who was at the right point, to knock it down between his skates, line it up, and let it fly, and he beat Andre Rathsiko with still 0.3 of a second remaining on the clock. So the Whalers, if Craven can get this draw back to Zalapsky, they'll be in business. He does. He kicked it to him in a wrist shot, blocked the rebound. They score! They score! And it was hacked in there by Adam Bird. It appeared. 1.1 second to go. The Whalers win it. Zalapsky took the shot. It bounced in the slot. Burt was spun around, and it got hacked up on the glove side as he was spun around, and he blindly hacked it, and Adam Burt wins the game. Unbelievable.
Well, gentlemen, Nostradamus. Chuck Caton. Hi, Chuck.
How you doing, Glenn? Yeah, that was a great memory. I could still picture the play at the Met Center in Bloomington, and it was incredible. And it couldn't happen to a nicer guy either. Adam Burt was just a terrific individual, great character guy. Probably had the least amount of body fat of any player in the NHL at that time. I think it was about 2%. So he was always in great shape, and he was a clean liver, and it was good on him. It was a wonderful moment. And if you notice the date, we don't get too many February 29th in the world every 4 years. So that was special in itself.
Okay, well, first Mark Howe's talking about all the weight he lost, and now you're talking about Adam Burt and his low body fat. I cannot relate to any of that. So
Either can I. Yeah.
But what I can relate to is there's a longer version of that clip where you spend time talking about a game, not a Whalers game, where there was also an end of game face-off win and a late score. And it was such a beautiful job of letting the fans know, hey, 4 seconds, stuff can happen. And then it did. And how rewarding is that?
Well, it is, and I think that's the part of broadcasting that I enjoyed the most, is giving historical perspectives to people on the game. And I think that's the biggest thing for me, is that giving people a little idea, being up on things. I mean, it's a lot easier today, certainly, than back it was in 1992, because you did a lot of research by reading rather than watching a lot of games. Today, you have so much information thrown at you from different directions that it's easy to do the research if you care to know a little bit about the history of the game. And so that's what I think was the most important thing, is to try to relate it. And I guess Pat Falloon of the San Jose Sharks did me a favor by doing it the night before. And so again, and I guess more than ever, I think you could say that hockey is a 60-minute game or 65-minute game if you're going into overtime, and you better be ready for every second of it.
You're there for the very first NHL game in Whalers history. Now, they come off a 4-game road trip to start the season without a victory. So what I want to know is, what do you recall about that very first NHL game against the Kings in Hartford?
Well, you're talking about the game in Springfield Civic Center, 79, my first year?
There you go, with Springfield. That's right.
Yeah, well, there were a couple of milestones. First of all, for me, the first broadcast I ever did was an exhibition game against Pittsburgh. And speaking of Mark Howe, his dad was my color man. And having grown up in Detroit and idolizing Gordie Howe as I had, that was a special thrill for me. But the first game at the Springfield Civic Center, I believe it was a 7-3 win by the Whalers over the LA Kings. Bob Berry was the coach of the Kings, and of course Don Blackburn was the Whalers coach. And it was a terrific game. And if I'm not mistaken, in that game, Mark Howe had a couple of goals in that game as well. It was just one of those things that, and it electrified the crowd. I heard Pat talking a little bit about, and rightly so, about how fate did play a positive in that roof collapse in '78. Because he's right. The Whalers would have never gotten an NHL franchise unless there was a commitment to build a new building with a 10,500 seat arena at that time. So expanding it as they did. But in Springfield, you got to remember, there were only something like 7,800 seats. And most nights it was packed with that 91 club, the people coming up I-91, which was a wonderful promotion envisioned by our late marketing director, the late Bill Barnes. And it was fantastic to see that many people enjoy that game. But it was a big win against the Kings, as I recall that day.
You mentioned Gordie Howe, 79-80 was his final season. And if I recall correctly, you actually got to know Gordie away from the rink. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say that we, again, right from the first day that I walked into the Bolton Ice Palace in Bolton, Connecticut for the first practice as a 27-year-old first-year NHL broadcaster who grew up watching Mr. Hockey and who went to the game as an 11-year-old kid when he tied Rocket Richard for goals in the National Hockey League with his 544th. I had to twist my dad's arm to see that game, and he said, it's real expensive to get to that game, and I don't think we can get a ticket. I said, well, I'll go. Let's go standing room only. And it was a real large sum of $1.50 to get standing room at the old Detroit Olympia. So I don't know. I don't know how much money my dad made back in those days, but it was expensive to go to NHL games even back then. But to get to know Mr. Howe as well as I did was just fantastic. After his career, I think some of the biggest thrills for me was that game in January of '80 when we went into Joe Louis Arena and Mark, Marty, and Gordy started against the Red Wings that day with the opening faceoff, house down, and then to get to know him off the ice after he retired that year. He stayed in the organization. He did a between period feature with me called Gordie Howe Talks Hockey. And again, we became very good friends. And I have to credit my wife, Mary, and a great deal of our relationship because she would make the best clam chowder and the best apple pies. And Mr. Howe always enjoyed those. And even after he moved back to Detroit and actually lived in Mark's house toward the end of his life, taking care of Colleen, my wife would make pies for him in the day. We'd visit him in the Detroit area because, as I said, I was from there. We were coming up to visit my mom and sister, and I'd always go out to lunch with Gordy, even in the latter years. So we did become very close, and obviously I was heartbroken when he passed away 7 years ago. It's still something that I think about quite often, and to be there at the time to mourn him, as many did in Detroit, was something special. And I just got some great memories of him. Such a classy person, just a wonderful individual. One of the best people I ever met in the game, obviously. And it's something how, Glenn, these superstar players are some of the best people you'll ever meet.
Did he ever give you an elbow?
Yeah, that's a good story. As I told you, my first broadcast was in September of '79, that exhibition game against Pittsburgh, and he did not play that game on opening night of the preseason. And I got an elbow. I walk up to my seat in the Springfield Civic Center radio booth, and then he comes walking in about 5 minutes before the game. I never even had a chance to kind of prep him about doing the game. But boy, I was on cloud nine, and the first thing he did was throw a right elbow at me just to loosen me up a little bit, because I'd have to say I was a little nervous sitting next to him. And he was just terrific. I mean, I got really two good memories about broadcasting with him that night against Pittsburgh, where I think we had to shut his mic off about 15 times when the hitting got spirited, because he would act like he was on the ice. Sometimes there would be some expletives coming out of his mouth because he was, even though he wasn't in the lineup, he was feeling the pain of some of the players as they were making their hits in the game. And then one night in Danvers, Massachusetts, we played a preseason game against the Boston Bruins. Ray Neufeld of the Whalers, I think, was a rookie that season, and Gordy came up and did the game with me. Again, unfortunately, the mic wasn't muted out because I was just there engineering my own game, and his mic was open, and Neufeld got run from behind by Brian Curran. And Gordy said a few choice things that I think the FCC wouldn't approve of today. Well, maybe they would approve of it today. They didn't approve of it then. But it was a chuckle. I started laughing. I lost it after hit that son of a. Then you can fill in the blank. And it was right on the air. It was terrific.
And what we've also learned tonight is that the way to Mr. Hockey's heart is through his stomach.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd have to say that. Yeah, he was just a great guy to be around. I mean, every time we would get together, both on and off the ice, like I said, I'd visit him in Detroit every summer after he moved back up there. I've been to his house in Traverse City. and I gotten very close to him, and it was almost a surrealistic relationship because here we are, a kid growing up in Detroit watching your superstar hero, and all of a sudden real life kind of clicks in, and you meet this person, you get to know them very well, and you find out that and then you meet his sons. I mean, Mark and Marty are very good friends of mine. Murray is a good friend of mine, and it's just a terrific family. And it's like being on cloud nine. I sometimes I still pinch myself to say, wow, did I really know Gordie Howe that well, and he knew me that well? It still boggles my mind because he was such a classy man.
Well, as we mentioned, both Mr. Howe and Mr. Caton are in the Hockey Hall of Fame. So the question then is, when has a hockey broadcaster really made it? Well, not by winning the Foster Hewitt Award, which Chuck did in 2004. No, sir. It's when one of your broadcasting buddies, in this case, John Forsland, performs an imitation of you on NHL Network. As John would say, here it is.
Well, let me tell you, I used to go there all the time. Back in the ooh-la-la days, of course, with many of the Rangers. I'm not going to say they were there that night because, as you know, they were playing the next night, and they would never do anything like that back in the day. But, I have charisma, and when I go out, people kind of gravitate towards me, and I thought I saw Barry Becker. Couldn't it be him? I thought I saw Bobby Duquet. Couldn't be him. Was Espo there, though? Who's in the... That's not Dave Maloney, is it? Dave's getting himself mentally prepared. Sailors are at the Garden the next night. Anyway, I'm here. Hello there, sugar. Whalers, and then Andy Warhol is nearby. It's not a pretty scene, and good thing it's too late for any of us to remember that evening what happened the next day, but as they say, those were the days.
Well, he's got a second career because he's got a comedy act in Seattle the way they've been playing right now. So he's great. So yeah, I guess I never heard that before. I heard about it at Studio 54. I thought John was 6 years old when that thing was going on, Joe Namath. But yeah, well, I guess it's the sincerest form of flattery, but I guess Johnny's in the right division, being in Vegas. He's going to play there about 4 times a year.
Yeah. So did you have a habit of calling the ladies sugar?
No, I think he made all of that stuff was made up. I don't know where I was a great impromptu situation. I think he was talking to Don LaGreca or something, a New York station or something, wasn't it? I think I heard about it. But no, he everything he must have done was so extemporaneous and creative that I don't think I could duplicate that. It's crazy. But yeah, I knew him for many, many years when he was doing Springfield games, and then he came to the organization in 1991, and he's carved himself a wonderful career himself. So it's good to see that he would be part of this program. And again, I'll be helping selling tickets to appearance in Vegas at the Bellagio,
or maybe the Chuckle Hut.
I don't know. We'll see. I'd like to own one of those places. Just
before we get into any more trouble, let's get Pat Pickens to rejoin us to discuss all things Whalers. Mm-hmm. And so I've got a survey for both of you, 5 questions, no right or wrong answers, just opinions, but I'd like to have you back up what you say. So here is question 1. The Cooperalls that Hartford wore for 1 season, love them or lose them? Pat, you go first.
I'm going to say lose them because as the Whalers, it's funny, the book didn't mention the Cooperalls because there was a lot of other stuff going on. And frankly, I hate the look, and I hate, a lot of people want to talk about the look, and obviously I think Chuck can discuss it better than I can, but as somebody who's watched hockey with the traditional pants, with the traditional socks, with the, growing up with the traditional uniforms, I'm all for, innovation and trying things and being creative, but I think that's a terrible look, I'd say.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with Pat on that. It was unique, and if you know the history of it, I think it was the 82-83 season, but both Philadelphia and Hartford had those, and the link between Howard Baldwin and Ed Snyder, the late Ed Snyder, the owner of the Flyers. Howard used to be the ticket manager of the Flyers years ago, so they had a very special relationship over the years. So, in fact, it even went into the television world because Prism New England was started because Prism in Philadelphia. The telecasts were kind of married to each other, and they shared programming and that type of thing. So, no, I would have to agree with Pat. Lose it.
Okay. Question 2, and this comes from the Whalers' 1976 exhibition victory against Tretiak and the Soviet national team. So watch the clip, but also listen.
Tommy Earl coming in, shoot, score! And the Whalers lead it 2-0.
Here's the question. Brass Bonanza, toe tapper or too tinny? Chuck, we'll let you go first.
Okay, I'm going to go first this time. I love it. The more people that hate that song, the more I love it because it was a signature. It's one of the most innovative things that you ever had in hockey, and that's another thing I have to credit Bill Barnes for and George Ducharme and all the people that came up with this signature theme song. In fact, when I got the job coming out of Madison, Wisconsin with the Badgers, the first thing I was told by a guy named Tom Ossington, who was the Blue Line Club president of the Badgers, he said he had spent some time in New England. And he says, the first thing you're going to love is their theme song. And he tried to sing it to me. And I thought, well, I'll just wait to hear it for myself. But I love it. Because the more people hate it, the more I loved it. And I think it was played a record 12 times one night against the Philadelphia Flyers, and it drove Mike Emmerich crazy when he was doing the games. He never forgot it. I think he put it in his book as well. So now I got to go for it. And the other thing they were innovative on, by the way, was teen stores. Whalers were the first one. Pat can attest that. I've been too much time. Pat, what do you think?
I love it. I can't get enough of it. I'm glad you brought up George Ducharme because I got to speak with him to get his whole tale, and there's a whole tale in the book about how he unearthed Brass Bonanza, Evening Beat as it is originally known. And it's funny. I was in Raleigh for Whalers Night this past January. And to see, I didn't get to go, I didn't get to see Brass Bonanza at the Civic Center. So, but to hear it played after Hurricanes goals on Whalers Night and to look at the crowd and to watch them clap along and stand and cheer along, I got taken back. I suspect it went to essentially what a time machine and what, people in the 70s, people in the 80s and what all the Whalers fans and all the Whalers organization saw all those years, because it was just this sort of raucous, but also like clapping along and cheering. And I think that what's funny, I talked to Barry Melrose, and to Chuck's point, where he just said, the more people hate it, he said he would go into that the games against the Whalers and he would hear that song and he knew he had to fight Al Hangsleven that night. And it added this sort of moment where it's like, oh no, not only do I have to listen to this god-awful, in his opinion, a god-awful song, but he also was going to have to fight, one of the toughest guys in the NHL at the time, or WHA at the time. So I agree. I love it. Can't get enough of it. Love hearing it, and honestly love seeing goals scored where the song is playing in the background. I think that's pretty special.
All right, Pat, you've led us into question 3 because the Carolina Hurricanes have held a pair of Whalers nights, wore the uniform, played Brass Bonanza, sold merchandise in the team stores. So the question is, tasteful tribute or tasteless cash grab? Pat?
I might be a little biased because the members of the organization, of the Hurricanes organization, have been quite good to me in terms of access, in terms of, there's a portion in the, I'm going to say, yes, I'm good with it now because I'll say my first reaction to it was that it would be the tasteless cash grab. But I think what's remarkable and how my opinion has changed is, again, sort of being down there, but again, talking to people like John Forsland, who would have said that it was a tasteless cash grab until they saw what went on in that first one, the first Whalers night, where Ron Francis had input into what uniforms they wore, and that they donated money to Bob Crawford's rink, or that there's a lot of Connecticut, New England transplants in Raleigh, in the Triangle region, that essentially went south. And it's their sort of way of hanging on to that. I mean, they become Hurricanes fans, and it's essentially like what the organization did. It migrated south, like a transplant in some degree. And I think there's obviously mixed reviews when you talk to fans, when you talk to people in Raleigh aren't necessarily ecstatic about it either. But I think Whalers fans and the Booster Club in Hartford, they talk about how it's how this team lives on, and it lives on through Brass Bonanza, it lives on through the jerseys, and it lives on through the logo, and it lives on through our stories of the team, Chuck's stories and Mark Howe's stories, and all the people who live this, and the incredible alumni base. And I think I'm not sure how I feel about Colorado wearing Quebec's jersey, or if other teams had took the opportunity to do that. But I think there's a special place for, and that this is for one night a year where the players love it, and the fans enjoy it, and it's that we start talking about the Whalers again, and how unique of a pro hockey team from Hartford, Connecticut. I think that's why I'm okay with it.
My opinion is completely the opposite. I've got to fact check Pat on this. Ron Francis was already fired before the first Whalers night. Did he have input on the uniform? I mean,
as far as I was told, yes, he was still the general when they started the ball rolling with Tom Dundon. That's what I was told. So, but I mean, yeah, you were.
Well, okay, I'll give you maybe, but I still think at first it was a cash grab. I do agree with Pat and probably people who think it's a positive that it does keep the memory. I also think it kind of rubs some fans the wrong way in Hartford. So I think that's up, but it's not up to me. If people enjoy it, that's what it's all about. That's what sports is all about. But for me, especially the first year, I think that under the circumstances that have occurred since, that it can't be a Whalers night without some of your key Whalers people. And for me, number one would be Ron Francis. Number two would be Skip Cunningham, who was there at the time, the longtime trainer who was with the organization from day one. So I guess I'm a little biased the other way. Let's put it that way.
I don't have a dog in this fight, but I kind of come down that I don't care whether you dress up in a tuxedo and you play a waltz. If you're dancing on someone else's grave, it's kind of tasteless. I don't care how tastefully you try to make it. If the Hurricanes had more of their own identity, they wouldn't have needed to borrow the Whalers. So that's kind of where I come down on that. But like you guys, no one asked me. So we'll move on.
Well, there's one thing. They did ask me, and I gave it an emphatic no that first year. That's all I'll tell you.
Good for you. Let's move on to question 4. And I also have some bias in this one. And this question is about the Whalers logo. You only have 2 choices. Love it or really, really love it. Okay, Chuck, you go first.
Oh, well, there's no question in my mind. When I first saw that logo, I really, really loved it. I thought it was so creative with the fluke and the H and the W. And thank the Boston Bruins for forcing the Whalers to be the Hartford Whalers as opposed to the New England Whalers, or that jersey probably wouldn't have been used with the H in there. So, yes, really, really love it.
Agree 100%. I talked to Peter Good, who's the graphic designer who put together the logo. It's remarkable to me that looking at how these things evolve, and the fact that one person could be responsible for producing that logo. And I'm going to put in a plug for the book, because Peter Good was great enough to share with some of his early designs, share with me, and they're in the picture section of the book, where some of the trial and error, he's held on to those all these years later, and some of the trial and error and things he tried, harpoons and different color accents, and how he ultimately came to that logo, I think is spectacular. And I think it's amazing because it was so far ahead of its time. You look at, the Hurricanes have had negative space logo, and the Golden Knights, Vegas Golden Knights, had negative space. But I think what's remarkable too is to hear the story that like Brass Bonanza, hockey people hated it, that it was so reviled, and that even in the Whalers organization, Howard Baldwin had enough foresight to say, this is good, I'm going to go with this. But there were people definitely in that organization who were like, what is this? Like, why are we? What is blue and green? Like, green is going to be for our NHL team. I mean, no, I know they had green in WHA, but this was the NHL, and these are things like the Detroit Red Wings and the Toronto Maple Leafs. Solid colors and blue and red, and a lot of those types. We're gonna be blue and green, and we're gonna have this Peter Good refers to it as engages the mind, and we're going to have a mind engaging logo. This is our logo. And I think what's unfortunate is that Brian Burke came in later on and changed the logo, changed the color scheme, and it's the logo and color scheme that I grew up with, the navy and with the gray accent. But I think it's unfortunate that color scheme and that logo ever changed at all, because it was so perfect. And I think that's why, that's really the reason the Whalers keep living on, is because, the logo is so spectacular, and the color scheme was so perfect, and those green jerseys are awesome. And the white home jerseys with the blue tail were incredible too. It was so far ahead of its time, and it was so unique that I think that's why hockey people tend to gravitate towards it.
Pat, Burke didn't like Brass Bonanza either. So was he just no fun back then?
I think he was just a hockey guy, and that was where it came from. Because to your point, he took Brass Bonanza off the ice for goals and for the intro, and I think he built that image. His image. He wants to build tough teams, and he wanted the Whalers to be tough, and the team he built was a tough team. And I think there were, his quote was, there were people that were embarrassed to have a theme song. There were people that were embarrassed to have a green jersey, to have a, this sort of Pucky the Whale mascot. And I think what's remarkable to me, and I think Chuck can speak to this too, is that that's the organization's identity, even now, but then too, that they weren't super successful on the ice, and that they weren't this, this dynasty. They weren't Edmonton. They weren't the Islanders. They weren't even the Penguins at that point, where, the Penguins had come in and won a couple of cups in a row, but they had this sort of kitschy, and the mystique that you were referring to, Glenn, with this kitschy Brass Bonanza and this kitschy sort of green jerseys. And we play in Hartford, Connecticut, and we play in an arena that's next to a mall. And that was their identity. And every team needs to have an identity. And I don't think it was bad by any means, but I think Brian Burke, and he was only there for 1 year, which is really what's unfortunate. And then he went to the league to take a job. But he, he really wanted them to be tougher and look tougher and look the part. And so that's what prompted that change.
Chuck, Brian Berkey could never have worked for the Chicago Cubs.
I guess not. I don't know. I loved Brian Burke. He did a lot of good things, but one of the things he was not good at was getting the pulse and the marketing pulse of the area. And I think that he didn't realize that the backlash would be pretty great with this kind of a real substantive and dramatic change, not only in the colors, but in the fact that you were taking some of the fabric and some of the tradition away from the team. So I think, and as Pat said, it's unfortunate. He was only there for a year. And then, of course, things got changed back again to where you had the theme song again. And I actually thought that with the change of colors, the team, I loved the green uniforms, but I was adaptable to the blue jerseys, the road jerseys at the time. And so it didn't bother me as much, but I do think that when you look at knowing your audience, that's always the key in any endeavor. And I think that Brian's mistake there was that that he didn't really read the pulse from a public relations standpoint of the fans.
Last question in our survey, and this comes from the Hartford Courant. They named these 6 as the best Whalers ever: Stoughton, Lee, Mark Howe, Dineen, Francis, and Liut. And let me ask you first, Chuck, if you had to name the sextet of best Whalers, are these also your 6, or who would make it on your list instead?
Wow, that's a good question. The only person that I would, and I don't know who I would replace that sextet with, because that's an excellent set. I don't think there's any question. Ronnie Francis, Mike Liut, Mark Howe, obviously, Blaine Stoughton for 4 years, Ricky Lee, again, heart and soul player. So I can't argue with any of these. And the only person I would probably have added, because of the class that he had in the organization, albeit only maybe 5 or 6 years total between WHA and NHL years, is Davey Keon. But I don't know where you would fit him in with that group of players, because I think those players represent longevity, and I think it's a pretty good group in all honesty. So I can't quarrel with it, really.
What about you, Pat?
Can't disagree. Maybe Ulf Samuelsson in place of Rick Lee, but otherwise, I would not. I think what's remarkable is Stoutland's record for goals in the franchise still stands, and it was in 79-80 was 56 goals, and it's all these years later it still stands, even through the 80s, even the high scoring 80s, even with Ron Francis. What was he, the 3rd or 4th all time in points? And I think, Mark Howe alluded to it. His departure from Hartford was just so unfortunate. And obviously Francis's departure from Hartford was so unfortunate. And I think what those guys all have in common is, and Lee was a coach and was in management too, is that they were all part of that special era. I talked about the narrative arc of the Whalers story, and Stoughton and Howe were of that first playoff team in Chuck's first year, in the first year of the NHL. And you look at Liu and the trade to get him in, and then to get to have guys like Francis and Dineen sort of come into their own. And there were some people may not believe this, and Chuck could certainly attest to it. There were some legitimate Stanley Cup contending teams for the Hartford Whalers, led by guys like Kevin Dineen, led by guys like Ron Francis, led in goal with Mike Liut, and other, if not for a couple of puck bounces. And I mean, frankly, just puck bounces or some goaltending here and there. There would have been a parade in Hartford. Maybe 86 stands out. 87, the team was the Adams Division champion. Again, same core as 86. And the one that I always point to that that really doesn't get enough herald in my mind is 1990, when the Whalers were like 7th in the league in points and 4th in the Adams Division, and then they played a series with the Bruins that went 7 games. And they were up 2-2, or there was 2-2. They were up 2-1 in the series, playing Game 4 at the Civic Center in Hartford, and they're up 5-2 after 2 periods, and they blew the lead, and they lost the game in regulation 6-5. They would have gone up 3-1. The Bruins didn't have Raymond Bourque for the majority of that series, and they would have gone up 3-1 on the Bruins. It was the first playoff series between the Bruins and Whalers. And the Whalers were that close to being up 3-1 and essentially, closing out the Bruins, who the team that went to the Cup final that year and lost to Edmonton. And yet, they blew, in true Whalers fashion, blew the lead, lost the series in 7, and then traded Ron Francis the next year, and the rest is history. But no, I really, it'd be hard to dispute because that's. People talk about the Mount Rushmore. Obviously, you'd have 6 faces instead of 4, but I think you could. Those would be the guys, the ones that the current listed.
Chuck, before we move on, any other comments?
No, I just have enjoyed this. I like to see, if we ever do this again about the history of the team. We've just kind of scratched the surface.
Oh, listen, Chuck, we're not done with you. I just meant about the 6 players. We got some more to talk about.
Oh, okay. Well, no, I mean, I don't have any other. Okay. It would, what would be interesting is who the fans think the best management was over that period of time. That would be a tougher one, I think. But I think people would. I think there'd be a consensus that the late Emil Francis would probably win that. So no, that's all I have there. I thought you were wrapping the show up. I'm sorry.
No, in fact, I'd like to discuss something for a second that isn't at all important, but I like it because it's nuts. And Chuck, I think you were there. January 15th, 1983, a blizzard in Hartford. The referee and one of the linesmen can't get to the game between the Whalers and the Devils.
Yep.
So tell me about the replacement officials.
Oh, the replacement officials. Once again, and I remember this vividly because this 82-83 year was the year of the Cooperalls, as we know. So they play this game because again, the NHL rule, for those who don't know, is if the visiting team's in town, you're going to play the game. And it's actually happened on a couple of occasions. There was a game against Buffalo that was played under same situations about 10 years later, as a matter of fact. And so this game you're talking about against the Devils, they had to summon one official from Boston to get there. And then we didn't have linesmen. So actually it was Ron Foyt, I think, who actually refereed the game. But the linesman had to be, wasn't it Ron? I guess it was. Now the linesman, it's interestingly enough, they picked one player from each team. At the time, a guy that had been with the Whalers earlier in his career, Gary Howe, was playing for the Devils, so he became one of the linesmen. And Mickey Vulcan was the other, the Whalers defenseman. So there you had it. You had Mickey Vulcan and Mr. Gary Howe on the lines. And if memory serves me, they only had to do a period or a period and a half until the officials from Boston could get in. And it was really amusing because I remember talking at that time to Max McNabb, who was the general manager of the Devils later years, about that game. And it just ceases to amaze you the things that can happen only in hockey that you wouldn't see in any other sport. I don't think you'd see somebody coming out of the bullpen to be the home plate umpire game, or somebody, or Shaquille O'Neal putting the zebra stripes on in the NBA because they didn't have a guy. So I mean, it is something, but it's something that makes hockey great and unique and fun.
I think that's a first and only in NHL history, if I'm right.
Well, and then you had the donut game where you had off-ice officials that have to officiate in New Jersey when Jim Schoenfeld insulted Don Koharski, and so then the officials walked out in that year. And
we know in that have another donut game that the replacements wore like yellow windbreakers, but
they had it come up. They didn't have any officiating uniforms, and there was a guy, I think John McGinnis is one of them, an off-ice official with the Devils that I saw for many years after that, and he was one of the guys that he was actually a minor league, not a minor league, but a youth hockey official in New Jersey. And so he had some credentials, but that was the only other time I can recall where you didn't have the regular officials doing a game.
Do you happen to recall what Mickey Vulcan and Gary Howe wore?
Mickey Vulcan had his, I remember he had Cooperalls and he had some kind of a white jersey or a yellow penny or something like that. And I think Gary Howe was wearing his Devil's pants with a yellow penny so they could differentiate themselves from the players. So they had to have a neutral color instead of the Whalers were wearing white. That's when the home team wore white, of course, and the Devils were in those Christmas colors. Remember, the red and green. So it was crazy. It was a very interesting time, that's for sure. And you're right. And Kenny Danico and I always talk about this whenever we see each other. When we saw each other when I was working, and we laugh about it because he was coming off his broken leg at that time of the year because he got hurt. You'll recall behind the net in a preseason game against the Whalers earlier that season in a preseason game when he ran into Eddie Hospodar and his leg Eddie kind of fell on his leg and broke it as they were battling behind the net. And so we always have a joke about that. And it's a great trivia question. Who were those two linesmen? So I'm sure great Whaler fans, and I'm sure Pat knew the answer too.
Well, let's move ahead now to 1986. The Whalers sweep Quebec in the playoffs and come within a goal of reaching the conference final. One of those, if for a puck bouncing one way instead of another, as Pat said. And then the team is honored with a parade. So, Pat, which was more surprising, the postseason run or the parade?
I'm gonna say the parade, because the parade has. I mean, I know Chuck told me that he didn't participate in the parade out of sheer just good for you, Chuck. But I think the run was pretty surprising to begin with, because the Whalers hosted the All-Star game that year, and right as they were going into the All-Star game, they were in a tailspin. Ron Francis was injured; he had a broken leg. And they were just tailing out and spinning out. And Emile Francis, we referenced Emile Francis, the fact that he was tinkering. He had acquired John Anderson. He had acquired a few other players, to play in that. And they were falling out of it. And this was in the days where the top four in each division made it. And the Whalers had finished fifth in the Adams division for every year since the first year. And they had this belief that they were going to be a playoff team, that they could be a playoff team. And they were really spiraling out. And if not for, everybody talks about Kevin Dineen, one punch, and Mike Milbury, and that moment, and then they against the Bruins, and he knocked out the Milbury. They had some bad blood the year before. Milbury had retired. Milbury came out of retirement to play defense for the Bruins because they had some injuries on their blue line. And everybody talks about Kevin Dineen one punching him and knocking him out, and how it galvanized the entire team and the entire organization. They went on this crazy run. They were like 8 points back of a playoff spot with something like, I don't know, like 6 weeks, maybe 6 weeks to go in the regular season, which, like, to think of now, to be 8 points out to make the playoffs. They made the playoffs by 4 points. And it's a heck of a run. It's an incredible run. But it all started with Kevin Dineen knocking out Mike Milbury. And then they took off and they got so hot. And they rode that to, like you said, to the sweep. They won game one in overtime, and they won game 3 in Hartford. The only playoff series they ever won, they clinched in Hartford. I think it was 9-4 in game 3 in this crazy penalty marred. The first period, there were ejections. There were insane number of goals. I think it was the Whalers. I think it was like 4-2 after one, or 5-3 after one, something like that. And then the Whalers took off. And I think they sort of caught the Canadians off guard. They had played that they'd won game 1. And Mike Liut, the goaltender, had been injured in that series, and so Steve Weeks came in, and Kevin Dineen scored this goal in Game 4 in overtime, where people called it the loudest they had ever heard the Civic Center. But so I think that was surprising. But when you look at the fact, and then obviously, like I said, to go to Game 7 in Montreal in the Forum and to tie it, they tied it in the last 3 minutes of regulation on a goal by Dave Babbage, if I'm not mistaken, and then to have that goal by Claude Lemieux broke their heart. And then, they get home and they say, hey, look, we're going to have a parade. We're going to throw you a parade because you won a playoff round. And the players talk about, Mike Liut specifically spoke that he loved it. He said that, again, we referenced the unique ownership situation that Hartford had, where Howard Baldwin was the managing general partner, but the city essentially funded the team in terms of, they sold shares in Aetna and Cigna, and even the Hartford Courant owned a piece of the team. And so they wanted to celebrate this incredible year in Whalers history, where they made the playoffs, where they won a round, the only playoff round they won in NHL history. And they took the Canadians to 7 games. It's incomprehensible now to have this parade while the playoffs are still going. And, and then Montreal goes and wins the cup, and then they throw an actual parade for their championship. So I would say the parade was more surprising, but the run was certainly stunning too.
Okay, Chuck, it's worth remembering that the Whalers gave the Canadians a much harder time than they had in either of the 2 next rounds, in the conference final and then the Stanley Cup final.
Yeah, it seemed like that. I mean, the bottom line is the bounce of the puck was always something that I had nightmares about in that series that Pat's talking about against Montreal that year. in '86 because the Quebec series was surprising or not because that was the last year of a best of five first round, and the Whalers swept the Nordiques 3-0. And then, of course, when they played Montreal, they had a chance to win the game in overtime when Ray Ferraro and John Anderson had basically a 2-on-none break from the blue line in a couple of minutes into the overtime. And I think that John Anderson wanted to pass the puck. He wanted to draw Patrick Waugh toward him and then give the puck to Ray Ferraro for an open net. And Ray Ferraro kind of backed off, and the pass went into the corner because Ray thought he was going to peel back for a rebound in case Waugh stopped Anderson, who really had a shot mentality for the in his career. And then, and as Pat said, but when you look at Montreal, they got through the New York Rangers, and then they end up playing Calgary that year, and they win the Stanley Cup. So it was the year that could have been for the Whalers. And again, history could have changed quite a bit. But to get back to that parade, I saw that picture of the executives with Howard in there with Emil Francis, and I see the late Bob Crocker. Look at him in that front seat, the passenger seat, that convertible. There's Jack Evans. And isn't that Andre Lacroix over there with number 30, that jersey? Oh, no, that's the guy that looks like him in the stats. They're in the but yeah, I didn't want to be part of that, and I think probably good thing I didn't lose my job over it. This parade was not basically organized, but it was sanctioned by the Whalers, but not organized. And I was supposed to go in the WTIC. I was going to sit with Arnold Dean. It was actually WTIC who asked me to be in the parade. So the Whalers never put any pressure on me to be in it. And I says, you know what? When I did Michigan football and Bo Schembechler didn't win the Rose Bowl, it was not a successful season. When I went on to Wisconsin and Bob Johnson did not win an NCAA title, it wasn't a successful season. So I wasn't going to be part of winning one round of the playoffs and calling it a successful season. I guess I was kind of an ornery young guy at that time.
You
Still
had
am,
principles.
because, again, there shouldn't be a Whalers night in Raleigh. I'll bring that up again.
Well,
yeah, they could have
unfortunately, that was also the high point because the last 12 seasons of the franchise did not include the winning of a playoff series. Chuck, how come?
Well, first of all, there was too much consternation in the front office, in my opinion. I mean, you think about the stability that the organization had under Emil Francis. And then with the ownership change, once Aetna started making a few bucks, they wanted to market the team and sell the team, and they ended up handing it over to Donald Conrad over Howard Baldwin. I don't know if you're going to talk about that with Howard, but Donald Conrad, who was I think the number 2 or 3 man at Aetna, got the opportunity if he could get the financing, and of course the financing came from Richard Gordon. And so from then on, I think we had a situation where and Richard and I talk about this. I still communicate with Mr. Gordon, who I think is a terrific individual, despite the fact that there were a lot of problems during the ownership time. He says he's learned a lot since then. He didn't, you think you have all the answers at the time. The Ron Francis trade happened under him. The fact that Eddie Johnston was hired as the general manager to replace Emil Francis, although Emil was still in the organization. I mean, there were a lot of things going on there that I think Richard would admit today he made a mistake on. And I think that, and then that's, I think, succinctly the reason that they didn't make the playoffs again until the 91-92 season under Jimmy Roberts as coach. So, a dry spell there. They made the playoffs, but they didn't go past the first round, I should say. I mean, they had a run there under Emil Francis, 6 straight seasons, and then on to the 91-92 season as well. And then after that, it dried up for 5 years. Then you had another ownership change in 94 when the KTR group came in and again had to start over again. See, you have different managements and different philosophies, and you have to really start all over again when it comes to management preparedness and that type of thing when it comes to building an organization and building a successful one.
Pat, your book describes these as years of, quote, bungled deals and ownership squabbles, which kind of go together. And I want you to comment on something Tiger Williams, who played for the Whalers, said, quote, "The organization, if fans would have ever realized how bad they were, it was sad."
I think, certainly in the early 80s, we talk about the, Howard Baldwin, there were definitely some growing pains in the early 80s too. But I think what I would say is, definitely there was some turmoil. It's certainly, it started with Jack Evans losing his job too, where he was going to be, I believe he was going to be a lame duck, and Emile Francis fired him. And that sort of started this sort of merry-go-round of ownership, movements. And it was like, it was Larry Plow, and then it was Rick Lee was the coach. And then it was, there was this constant, revolving door. And again, they were making the playoffs, but at some point, the community started to check out in terms of the first round exits, where again you lose in games. You play the Canadiens, the Cup champion, to the end of a series. You're going to get some people. They won the Adams division 86-87, and they had this just ridiculous. Chuck was right, where they went to the best of 7 in the first round. They lost, and they went up 2-0 on Quebec, and they just got caught in this web of penalties and goaltending and this momentum that Quebec built. And then they went and they played the Canadiens a couple of years in a row, and the fans stopped coming for the playoff games, which was a huge message. And rightly so. Chuck mentioned Howard Baldwin's exit, where it turned it over to Don Conrad and Richard Gordon, and there was some infighting too between those two, where they were in court and they were battling for the ownership stake of the team, which ultimately Richard Gordon came away with, and the financial woes. And Hartford was always a small market, and as the revenue streams cropped up in other places, in other cities, as teams expand, as the league expanded, it became harder and harder to compete in Hartford. And I think the Ron Francis trade is really we can talk about first round exits, and we could talk about owners and coaches and general managers and jersey changes and whatnot. But to talk to the Ron Francis trade to Pittsburgh, when it was him and Ulf Samuelsson and Grant Jennings for Zarley Zalapsky and John Cullen, was really, I refer to it in the book as a detonation, and it was referred to me by Michael Arrace, who covered the team for the Hartford Current, works for the Columbus Dispatch now, and the detonation of an era, because they had this incredible, this talent, this Stanley Cup caliber talent, again, with character guys, with guys who love to be in Hartford. Joel Quenneville, Ron Francis met his wife in Hartford. Kevin Dineen met his wife in Hartford. Joel Quenneville, they used to hang out at the Quenneville Ranch, after practices and after games, and they were a community, and it was the core of the team. They had the softball team. They had they'd see each other in the grocery stores. Chuck talks about how people still go back to Hartford, all these 25 years later or more in some cases. Ronnie still goes back. Him and Dineen and Quenneville, they were all together in Connecticut, I believe, if not mistaken, after the Blackhawks won the Cup in 2015, where they were all celebrating together. And so, and yet, when Ron Francis gets traded, it's the missing link to 2 consecutive Cup teams in this sort of dynasty caliber program in Pittsburgh, and then the city almost doesn't recognize the team beyond that, because again, you're talking about Emile. You had consistency with Emile Francis and Jack Evans and Ron Francis and Joel Quenneville and Ulf Samuelsson, and as the team didn't win in the first round, there was there were some question marks about, well, can we win with Ron Francis? And they is Ulf Samuelsson really a player we can build around? And then Ulf got upset. He wanted to compete for the Cup, and he didn't think he was going to be able to do it in Hartford. So I certainly there was definitely management issues, but and definitely some terrible decisions got made in there. But ultimately, I think it was puck luck too, to some degree. I referenced the '90 series in Boston. I referenced '87 against Quebec, where they're up 2-0, and the series didn't go their way, and they got caught up in Dale Hunter and some other crazy nonsense. But ultimately, Chuck and I talked a few years ago for the book, and we sort of agreed with sort of an economics thing that was why the team sort of got doomed ultimately. That not that it was destined to fail entirely, but that, you know, the league and the economics and all these things sort of caught up in Hartford, and they didn't have an answer necessarily to account for it all.
So the detonation, March 4th, 1991, when Ron Francis, Ulf Samuelsson, Grant Jennings traded. Think about the team that the Whalers had in 1990. Listen to these names: Francis, Samuelsson, Babbage, Young, Dineen, Verbeek, Ferraro, Cote. I mean, that's a team that you could have won with. And Chuck, maybe if they had stayed together, maybe they would have.
Yeah, I think so, but I think ultimately the economics of the game changed. Everything changed when Eric Lindros wouldn't go to Quebec, in my opinion, for the league. And then you had the expansions that we're talking about. Of course, the single expansion to San Jose in '91, not big deal. But then once you got people coming in from Ottawa and then Tampa and then Florida and Anaheim a couple of years later, that changed everything. And so did the mood of the Players Association, because while the 80s were run by Trottier and Gretzky in terms of the Players Association, they were pretty amicable because of Alan Egelson's relationship with the owners in the NHL, that everything was, from a cost standpoint, pretty, let's put it this way. You'd have the haves and the have-nots in terms of ticket sales, but you didn't have salaries going crazy. And if you did want to offer somebody, I remember when $1 million contract went to Brett Hull, he was the first $1 million guy after Wayne Gretzky was offered that. And then the gates opened in the late 80s, early 90s. And then once you had the player strike in 1992, that changed everything. So I think from a standpoint of being a small market team, it was a blessing and a curse for the Hartford Whalers. And I think that's part of the aura and the mystique. And you talked about the longevity of why are the Whalers a team that is still so popular today? Why do people? It's not because of Whalers night in Raleigh. It's because the bottom line is it's still seen as the last of the small market teams. I mean, right now with the salary cap, everybody's got a chance to spend whatever they want to spend. But it was untenable back in those days. And I would contend that Hartford was the only small market team in the United States back then. Because if you remember, the other three WHA teams were Canadian-based and had a bigger fan base. So that was another problem, I believe. But when we went from 80s to 90s, and especially after the players' strike and then the strike of 92, which lasted a couple of weeks, players tried to assert themselves before the playoffs, got what they wanted in terms of ancillary income. But then in '94, when we had the entire lockout that knocked out all but 48 games, that was the beginning of the end for a team like Hartford. And of course, 3 years later, we saw what happened. So economics were the biggest thing that that killed the Whalers, because I really believe that unless even if the team would have had the success that we're talking about, Glenn, with the team, and it was a good team, but the economics wouldn't have been there. I don't think people would have paid $60, $70, $80 for tickets eventually, even if they would have had a new building. That would have been interesting. But of course, they didn't have that opportunity because the team wasn't as successful as it should have been to drive that opportunity. So it was kind of the chicken and the egg thing. If you're not winning, you're not going to draw. But would they have drawn even if they would have won with the economics that were changing in the National Hockey League?
And the death notice comes a couple of weeks before the end of the regular season in 1997. Before we discuss, here's dueling sound bites from the governor, the mayor, and soon-to-be Carolina Hurricanes owner, Peter Karmanos.
The Whalers would not agree to a long-term lease, rent-free, $147 million facility, pay all the costs for the next 3 years, and no surcharges or taxes on tickets or suites. In addition to that, they wanted the suites, the luxury suites, to all have been sold and committed to by May 1st, and that season tickets would reach 13,000 by May 1st.
Well, if the state of Connecticut was willing to spend taxpayer money to subsidize the team, yeah, of course we could have stayed.
Every time the state responded to the Whalers, the bar went up and the bar went up, and it just seemed like he did not have any intentions. As I read through that stuff today, it just got more ridiculous.
To our loyal fans and to the corporate community who worked so very hard on this, we want to say how deeply sorry we are that things are working out this way.
Separate fact from fiction here, Pat. The only people, as I see it, that were not at fault for the team leaving were the Hartford fans.
They definitely have their share of blame to be thrown around, to be frank, because and honestly, like Chuck said, who could blame them, because the team wasn't winning. The team didn't make the playoffs for the last 5 years. They were in Hartford, and but season tickets went to I was told around 6,000 after the Ron Francis trade, which, if you're trying to drum up support and keep a team in town, that's not going to help your matters when you give off the impression that people there don't care. But to your point, Peter Kermanos, I'm grateful to him because he was such a great resource for my book. And he doesn't talk a lot about Hartford. And for some reason, he was willing to speak with me on the record. I went to speak with him near Chuck's old stomping grounds out in Birmingham, Michigan. And the way Peter Kermanos put it was that he felt that he was kicked out of Connecticut, of Hartford, because Governor John Rowland, they said they had a meeting at the governor's mansion in January. It actually predates all the move stuff. And that, Peter Kermanos talk about it, where he said that, they had a meeting and they said, don't say the team needs to move if they can't get a new arena. And then Rowland went on the record the next day at a press conference and said, he was asked, will the team need to move if they don't get an arena? And the governor said yes. And so in Kermanos' mind, that was him saying, look, we don't need you here. We don't want you here. There's a lot of scuttlebutt that the region was trying to lure the New England Patriots. That is true. They were trying to bring the Patriots to Hartford around those days, and famously got played like a fiddle by Bob Kraft, who got a sweetheart deal in Foxborough, Massachusetts, to stay there and build a new stadium. The people that I was told from the Rowland camp said that they were willing to do both, that the Patriots deal was not a detriment to retaining the Whalers, and that, like the soundbite said, that every time they would meet a demand, the ask would go up. And I think I honestly think that in Kermanos' mind, as the proud and I'll say stubborn guy that he is, he thought that it didn't matter at that point. No matter what they asked for, they didn't want them there, and that he wanted to get out. And obviously, the story goes he wanted to go to Columbus initially. And they couldn't get a referendum passed for the arena, and then he was sort of up a creek because he looked at Minnesota, he looked at San Diego, and ultimately got a phone call from the mayor of Raleigh. They're building a new arena for NC State basketball, and he said, "Hey, look, we could use a tenant. Do you want to come play in Raleigh once it's done?" And then obviously they went to Greensboro, and that was a mayhem. But yeah, but that's just how I understand the story, is that Peter Kermanos and even the players, Kevin Dineen said that too, used that language that the governor kicked them out. And I was curious to know, because, that's not part of the story. People don't talk about, well, the governor kicked us out. But from the organization's perspective, for the people who were there, that's how they see it.
Well, Chuck, I want to play your final sign-off from the last game, and then we'll have you comment.
All righty.
The surrealistic final scene of the Civic Center Coliseum. You don't normally see the numbers hanging around at the end of a season. But listen, they're not hanging around. They're just trying to seep in what is left of the memories of National Hockey League play in the city of Hartford, Connecticut, USA. So that's the story from Hartford, the Whalers 2, the Lightning 1, and somewhere along the line, we will see you in another place, in another time. And again, God bless all of you fans. And remember one thing, you may have lost the NHL, but you have not lost the memories. I'm Chuck Caton. Good day, everyone.
Whew.
Well,
Chuck?
yeah. Yeah, it still gives me goosebumps. And Glenn and Pat, thank you. That came from the heart. I mean, you don't script anything like that. I purposefully did not. I wanted to let the moment seep in, and it still brings me to tears today because it didn't have to happen. I think there's a lot of things that have been said, and this is where misunderstandings always occur when one side talks about things and another side doesn't. I will just say that I trust the businessman more than I trust the politician. Let's put it that way. All right. That'll tell you where I stand on it. And I am not saying that because Mr. Karmanos was my boss when we made the transition, because there was a question whether or not I was going to even come to Carolina, because like a lot of people that might be watching this and a lot of people at the time, I was saying to myself, what in the heck are we doing going to Raleigh, North Carolina? But truthfully, that's how I felt, because as Pat said, there's one city he left out that Mr. Karmanos wanted to go to, and ironically does have a National Hockey League franchise now, and that's Las Vegas, Nevada. Because he was 30 years looking at 25 years or 20 years too early. Who would have ever thought we'd have betting sites advertising on NHL games and sports teams in general? Yet Gary Bettman at the time said, you can't go there. We don't condone this. But Peter Karmanos could have been a groundbreaking. If he had to move anywhere, he wanted to go to Las Vegas. He knew the Columbus situation, as Pat documented, was untenable because there was not going to be any corporate support for a relocated team. And Minnesota was not viable. Take a look at it. What happened 3 years after we moved? Those two cities got NHL franchises. Gary Bettman had them in the back pocket for expansion money because the owners want that expansion money, which has now risen to $650 million.
Mm-hmm.
Seattle makes payments, right? So, and then it was a hefty sum even back in 2000. So, the course of history would have changed, and of course there were a lot of travails coming to Raleigh. With playing in Greensboro the first 2 years. It was a nightmare, in short. It was. And I think there was a one night that after we had 4,000 people for a 4-4 tie with the Ottawa Senators just after the new year of 97, 98, and we were taking a trip, I think, somewhere on the road, and we were outside on the bus. I'm waiting to get on the bus to go to the airport in Greensboro. And Mr. Karmanos was out smoking a cigar, and I used to like to have a cigar once or twice with him, and we'd be out there waiting for the bus, and he gave it a puff, and he said, well, did we make a mistake or not coming here? And I said, I'll answer that question in about 10 years. And I answered it for him when they won the Stanley Cup in 2006, and I said, no, you didn't make a mistake. So if you had to move anywhere, Raleigh turned out to be a pretty good place to live. It's my home now. I still feel for the people in Hartford, though. I can tell you that, Glenn and Pat. And you know where my loyalties lie. I'll always come to weekend with the Hartford Yard Goats every July. My good friend Dean Zappalordi puts that on. And so I'll always support that. But, they could have been a team in Vegas. There could have been a team there in 97, but it was just a little too soon. So, that's the way life works sometimes.
Chuck, as we prepare to wrap up this section with you and Pat and head on to the interview with Howard Baldwin, to your everlasting credit, when the Canes did win the Stanley Cup in 2006, you mentioned the Hartford Whalers. So feel free to comment on that or anything else you want to say in conclusion.
Well, in conclusion, I think, Glenn, I want to thank Paul and Laura and yourself for taking the time to bring this to our viewers. And as far as the tribute to Whaler fans, well, hey, they were part of the organization. They were part of the fabric of the NHL, and I was just lucky enough to be there from day one of their NHL existence. And I thought I would recognize that with the over 9,300 days that the team was in the NHL from 1979 to 2006. And again, tip my hat to all the great fans who supported the Whalers over the years, and the tremendous fans in Raleigh that continue to support the Carolina Hurricanes. I think it's wonderful. And I just can't believe, I guess it's because we're all getting a little older, that this team's been here 25 years now in Raleigh when they spent 18 NHL seasons in Hartford. So it's almost going to be surrealistic someday that, and knock on wood, the organization never moves again. But I would have to say that that's been my biggest takeaway. Thank you for moderating, and thank Pat for being on the program as well. And I hope we've enlightened and entertained people. And boy, gosh, it was awful nice to see Mark Howe at the beginning of the show.
And Pat, we'll give you the last word of this section.
Boy, you're giving me the last word. Boy, I saw Chuck, Hall of Famer Chuck Caton and Hall of Famer Mark Howe, and I feel like like what Chuck was talking about with Gordie Howe. I'm just happy to be here, happy to be on the line with those two guys, and that you guys know who I am. The fact that this book took me 10 years to complete, and that I really wanted to tell the story in an unbiased way. I worked in Connecticut. I was a sports writer in Connecticut. Covered the league for the NHL, for NHL.com, and for New York Times, and for a bunch of other places through the years. But to get to know people, and to get to again, to hear Mark Howe and to get to know him a little bit, to talk to Chuck, and everybody said you got to talk to Chuck Caton. You can't write this book and not talk to Chuck Caton. And I'm just so grateful for all the people who gave me their time through the years, whether it was Ron Francis, whether it was Kevin Dineen, whether it was again Mark Howe or Chuck or Jeff Jacobs or John Forsland or anybody through the years that I was a 26-year-old kid in Connecticut. Essentially my sports writing career was dying. I was covering Fairfield, Connecticut high school sports, and I had an idea to write a book. And Howard Baldwin was one of, Mark Howe was the second interview I did, and Howard Baldwin was the third. And the project took off, and I'm ashamed to some degree that it took me 10 years to complete. But I'm so excited and so ecstatic for how it came out, and so grateful for how it came out, and to, then to see you guys and have you guys have the reception from Whalers fans to talk about what I really wanted to do was to tell the story of the team for the people who lived it, but also for the people who may not know the history of the Whalers, because I started with a blank slate. I certainly didn't have the experience in terms of lived experience that Chuck did, or a lot of people did, but I really just came in with a blank slate and wanted to tell the story of the team, because it hasn't been done before. And if not for Chuck, and if not for Mark Howe, and if not for Howard Baldwin through the years, and Ron Francis and Ray Ferraro and Kevin Dineen and all these people, who knows whether there'd be a book about the Whalers at this point. And that I just feel so fortunate to be the person that was able to do it and put it together and execute it. And I'm just so grateful for the response that it's gotten so far. The book came out in October, and it was #1 on Amazon the day it came out in terms of hockey books. And this is my first book, and it took me, it took a lot of crazy twists and turns. I wasn't sure I could do it. I wasn't sure, I could become, get on the level where I could tell these stories and get on to the point where, people, Whalers fans and Whalers people who lived it would take me seriously enough and take the story seriously enough. And the reception's been fantastic. And I couldn't have done it again. I love the hockey community. There's a lot of problems with the hockey community with in terms of inclusion, in terms of diversity, in terms of some of the things that we hear on a daily basis. There definitely is a place for more inclusion and more diversity in hockey. But I'm so grateful for the hockey community, because it's a small group of people. I think you guys would agree. It's a small group of people. It casts a wide net, but it's people helping people in a lot of ways. And whenever I had a question, whether it was to talk to, an email, to send Chuck an email, or to send Mark Howe an email, or to send, whoever, or to talk to one person who would put me in touch with this person, who put me in touch with that person. The first interview was Ken Holland, and Ken Holland played one season in the book, and Ken Holland put me in touch with Mark Howe, and then Howard put me in touch with another person, and it just sort of fed on itself. And so I'm so grateful to be this little part of this hockey community with this book. I keep this book on my desk, just because I'm so proud of it. I'm so ecstatic for how it came out. And again, it took me 10 years to complete. From the first interview I did with Ken Holland was November 2nd, 2011, and the book came out on October 15th, 2021. And it shouldn't take anyone 10 years to write a book, but I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to do so, and I'm so grateful again to Chuck and to Mark and to all the producers and to you, Glenn, also for considering me and for having me on here, because I could talk about the Whalers all day, and I love hearing stories about the Whalers. And I'll close with this because I said this that one of the real treats was hearing stories about Gordie Howe, and I think every person who I spoke with who was in the organization in the 1980s, because like Mark said, Gordie stayed with the organization through. Was with them in the WHA and then the first year in the NHL, and then stayed in the organization in their front office. And I couldn't get enough hearing Gordie Howe stories, whether it was, he said the elbows, whether it was the crossword puzzles, whether it was, the lessons he'd teach people, the memory that he had, and that he, Gordie Howe is sort of in hockey circles known as this rough and tumble guy, and obviously Mr. Hockey and the guy who scored all these goals and was this incredible player in his day. But then to hear about him, the person, and to hear about the family man, and to hear about Mark alluded to the story of him getting injured, and that Gordie Howe was there with Mark when he was injured in the doctor's room, and how, the proud father and the scared father, that he wasn't sure his son was going to live through that injury that he sustained on the ice. And I'm so grateful that to be a vessel, but also just to learn all these things and just to hear all these things, and just to like I said, I could listen to this stuff all day. I'm just so grateful to be part of it.
Well, Pat, we are indebted to you, the vessel, Pat Pickens, and the Hall of Famer, Chuck Caton, who someday, Chuck, we need to have you back and discuss the ringette line. And your career on the
and how about Kenny Holland? One game. I always give him grief about this. I did at the Hall of Fame as well when I saw him in the lobby. He's played one game for the Whalers, lost it 7-3, Madison Square Garden. But that doesn't take away from him because he's a terrific individual. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I want to thank you both very much. This has been really a delight, and we look forward to when we have the opportunity to talk to you again. Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you, Chuck. Good to see you, Chuck.
Take care, guys.
So now on to Howard Baldwin, who organized the ownership group that brought the Whalers to New England in 1972. And through the arrival of the Howes, the move to the NHL, and much more, he remained managing general partner through 1988. We spoke with him a few days ago. Howard, even Walter Mitty would be jealous of the life you've led. And even before the age of 30, you were captain of your high school hockey team. You joined the Marines. You had a tryout with the Detroit Tigers. But the first thing I want to ask you is about when you were business manager of the Flyers ECHL team. How did you end up as coach?
Well, that is a fun story. The coach was a fellow named Vic Stasiak, who was on the famous Uke line in Boston, and then he played in Detroit. And he came to us for, I'm sure it was meant to be a one-year gig. Lovely guy, loved him. And we batched it together, and I guess it was end of January or something that he said, we had a break in the schedule of like 5 days. And he said, I've just got to go back to Lethbridge to take care of this land I've wanted to buy forever, to make a golf course out of it or something. I don't know what it was. I really didn't even know where Lethbridge was. So he said, you take the team and run them through their practices. I'll give you the lists of what you have to have them do, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, but don't tell anybody because I don't want the Flyers to get mad at me, Bud Boyle. I said, don't worry about it. I'll coach, do whatever I have to do. But I wouldn't kid you. I was pretty nervous about it because I'd say 60% of the players were, 70% were a lot older than I was. So I did. That week I'd run them through the practice, and we had no glitches except for the first day when the wind sprints came about, and I started having them go up and down the ice. And after about 6 of them, the one player, Reggie Meserve, very tough guy who played in the Eastern League his whole career, and a very tough guy bangs me on the rear end with a stick and said, "No, I think that's enough of the wind sprints, don't you, Howard?" And I said, "Okay, Reggie, that's good enough for me." But the crunch time came Thursday when a big blizzard was moving in, and somehow Bud Poyle called, saying, he would call me like once or twice a week, just checking in, but he had no idea that Vic was gone. And he said, "Now, is Vic around? Can I talk to him?" And I said, "No, he's not here." He said, "Where is he?" Well, I couldn't lie to him. I said, "Well, he had to go for an emergency back to Lethbridge." He said, "What do you mean? Who's coaching?" And I said, "Well, I've been coaching." He said, "Well, you tell Vic to call me as soon as he gets back." Well, Vic was due back Friday morning. Well, Friday, it was just a blizzard. And I'm thinking, so I called Bud up and said, "Look, Vic is not back. I don't know that he's going to get back. We got a game tonight against our arch rival, the Long Island Ducks, with John Brophy, and they were a tough bunch of guys." And Bud said, "Look, you two guys, you got yourself into this mess. You get yourself out of it. So you coach the team tonight." And I said, "Bud, I can do practices, but I can't coach this team." And he said, "Yes, you can. You're the coach." He hung up on me. About 45 minutes to an hour before game time, Vic showed up, thank God, and coached the team. But that was it. And Vic survived it. I survived it. And I don't know whether we won the game that night or not. It would be kind of fun to look that up. But that's the story.
And then you read about the formation of a brand new hockey league. What happened next?
My partner and good friend Johnny Coburn and I, we were just in the back office of this clothing store that he owned, and we saw the article and said, "Gosh, let's look into this." And this was like, gosh, it would have been 71, right around June of 71, right when the league was formed, officially formed out of Orange County. And so we called, information, got the number, and Dennis Murphy was the first guy I spoke to. And he, told us about the league. And I think they liked the fact we were in Boston, because they felt that was obviously a great hockey market. And they liked the fact that I had worked for the Flyers, even though they had, really not clued in on the fact that I was ticket manager. So I didn't know much more than tickets. So, so it went from there, the dating game, if you want to call it that, went from there. And, we met Dennis, great guy. Gary Davidson's still alive. We just had dinner with him last night.
You not only become part owner of the Boston-based, as you mentioned,
right,
New England Whalers, the team wins the Avco World Trophy in your first season. What was that year like?
It was a really, there's no other way to put it other than a Cinderella year. Now, we had issues. There were franchise issues. Our franchise was well financed, and we did a good job in the marketplace. Jack Kelly did a brilliant job in drafting players. We had a good team, good solid team from top to bottom. So there was never really a doubt it was us in Winnipeg. So it was just the year really spoiled me forever, because when you have a year like that, you win everything, and then you expect to do that every year, and it doesn't work that way. But it was a great year.
You mentioned Jack Kelly. Obviously, you don't hold grudges, because when you went to college, Boston College, he cut you, and then you hire him.
Yeah, well, he didn't. We always joke about it, but he did not. He'll always say, "I didn't cut you. I was going to keep you on the team." And technically, he's right. But I would have been like one of the last 2 or 3 guys, which would have been fun, but I just didn't have the discipline and the desire to do the kind of things that had to be done to play on the team. And it's probably one of the few regrets I have to this day. It would have been fun to play on that team. But when we had that meeting in his office and I saw the care that he had for me and my feelings and all, it stayed with me forever.
After a couple of years, scheduling games at Boston Garden becomes such a headache. The Whalers can't even play all their games at Boston Garden. So you decide we have to have a city of our own. Why Hartford?
Yeah, and Glenn, to be clear, it was really after 1 year. Our first year, we played a split schedule. We did great in the Garden. We did not so great in the arena, Boston Arena. Second year, we had all our dates in the Garden. And we figured, okay, we're going to pick right up off the average that we had in the Garden the first year. Didn't work that way. The bloom was off the rose. It was a novelty the first year. And fans, we had a good group of hardcore fans, but not enough. Probably one of the smarter things we did was we realized early on the second season that it wasn't going to work in Boston. And our financial partner, Bob Schmertz, a wonderful guy, was having some financial reversals. And he said, Howard, we got to solve this because, I have to get out. So that coupled with we didn't build off that first year. We were in fact going in the wrong direction, even though the team was still doing well. So there's another newspaper story, but I read in the New York Times that the building manager in Hartford had just broken off negotiations with a guy named Charlie Finley, who you'll remember that name. They were going to put an ABA team in there. So I called Bill Lillyman up and said, hey, I see you're not going to make your deal with Mr. Finley. Would you like to talk to us? And he said, come on down. And that's what happened. I went down, show you how much we knew about Hartford. We chartered a plane from Boston to Hartford, which is less than a 2-hour ride. And when we got there, we met at the top of the Capitol Bar and Grill because the Civic Center wasn't built yet. They had the arena under construction, but they didn't have their offices there or anything. Met the building manager and a fellow from the Aetna, Don Conrad, and we made a deal in an hour, within an hour to come there. And that would have been early December. And by third week in February, we had the first press conference. Pretty amazing.
For a group in Boston that treated you so poorly, is this right that they actually tried to use a Zamboni to block you from getting your stuff and taking it away out of the Garden?
Yeah, keep in mind, the only people that treated us poorly were the Boston Garden manager. The fans were great. The media was very fair to us. We had no complaints other than there weren't enough fans. But the Garden people busted our every chance they had. And we knew once it broke in the story, in the papers, our people were angry, our hardcore group of fans were angry. And we just said, let's just make life a little miserable for the Boston Garden because they had made it miserable for us. So there were like 6 games of rent that we owed. And we knew we had to pay it, but when the last game was played, we were going to load the trucks up and head to Springfield. We played the playoffs in Springfield. And when the trucks were all loaded up, they backed the Zamboni in the tunnel so you couldn't get cars out. There was a stalemate all day until Weston Adams Jr., I don't know if you remember that name, but he had to go home, and his car wasn't going to go home unless they moved that Zamboni.
And that is how great conflicts end.
Yeah, well, and we, of course, we got the trucks out, and the next day we paid the rent. So, case made.
So 2 ways I read that people would know that the Whalers were more than just a business proposition to you. And here's one. During a season, during the games, how many packs of gum would you go through?
Oh, gosh, you'd have to ask my wife, Karen, that question. A lot of packs. I mean, I went through a lot of them. I don't know how many, but went through a lot. And a lot of Diet Cokes.
The other way is because when the team didn't play well, one time you told your general manager, Ron Ryan, to, quote, start looking for new players. And another time you said, quote, any player not giving 100% effort on the ice at any time will be suspended and fined. Why did you care so deeply about the team?
Well, I love the team. And I don't recall some of that, but I probably did say things like that. I was young and there was tremendous pressure, and it would frustrate me with guys that were making 5 times what I was earning would, maybe take a night off or two. But, you care because you love the sport. I'm competitive and you want to win. And, when you make the effort to do everything right for the players and the team, and it's not hard to figure who's working hard and who isn't. You tend to get ticked off. So that's what would happen. That's life in the fast lane.
For the 77-78 season, Gordie Howe comes to Hartford along with his sons, Mark and Marty. So if you would tell us what the backstory was about their arrival.
Well, as you know, the Howes played for Houston. And Colleen Howe, Gordie's wife and the mother of Mark and Marty, was a manager and, of course, mother. And she was good, let me tell you. Colleen Howe was a great lady. She was a tough lady, and you had to negotiate hard with Colleen.
She was the family business manager, right?
Yes, she was. And the negotiations didn't go well in Houston. And so it was actually the middle of the season before we signed him. The owner of Houston called up and said, Howard, they're all yours. I can't take it anymore. Just traded him to you. I said, what do you do Saturday morning? I said, you can't do that. And then hung up the phone, and then I get another call right away from Colleen, who was laughing. And she said, Howard, we love you and we love Hartford, but we aren't going anywhere. We're under contract to Houston. We're going to stay out the year, and then we can talk. And I said, of course. And we did. We competed with the Bruins the Bruins had no intention of signing Gordie. They were really only interested in Mark. And we were going back and forth with Colleen. The final day was like 2 or 3 days in Detroit. And they finally said, okay, we're going to sign with you guys. That was a Thursday, and I said, it'll take a long time to get her to actually sign a contract. So I knew that the trick was to have the press announcement.
Leverage.
Yeah, well, I just said, Colleen, let's get this announced. It's such a big announcement and takes the pressure off everybody. And thank God she agreed. So we announced it Monday. Now, I don't believe they ever really told Harry Sinden until maybe the last minute. If I really don't know. I wasn't privy to that, but I know the Bruins they always held that against us for years because they felt that they had the house. They were going to get Mark, and they didn't. We got him, and we got Marty, and we got Gordie.
A silly question, but how much did bringing the Howes to Hartford impact the franchise and hockey in the city?
It was huge. There's a part of me thinks to this day, Hartford doesn't really appreciate enough what they had. We had 2 All-Star games, WHA and NHL, 85, 86. You had the Howes there. You ended up Bobby Howe. People don't remember this, but the last game Bobby Hull ever played in the NHL was for the Hartford Whalers. And so you've got a great hockey tradition there, and it solidified the team in the marketplace. To have an iconic figure, star, wonderful family like the Howe's come there and play. Made Hartford a very credible, when I say major league city at the time, that's what it was.
Also in 1977, you take on this little side hustle as president of the World Hockey Association, and pretty quickly you engage the NHL in merger discussions. Several attempts come close, but don't get quite over the goal line. How come?
Well, we had to bridge a lot of emotional waters, okay? And the first round of meeting was in Montreal. And people forget the first round, we actually were voted in. And then the Hawks, is that what they are? The Hawks circled the wagons, and we were voted out in August. But we were voted in, the 4 teams that got in, plus Houston and Cincinnati. In June, they were going to play in our own division with interlocking 12 times a year, 12 games total. And then the Harold Ballards and some of the Hawks rallied the troops, and it fell apart in August. We went back at it the year after in Detroit, and we came very close. But we knew then after Detroit, the second round, we could get this done. And we did get it done in the fall. But it was some battles.
After the merger talks broke down in March of 79, you're shocked. And what's more, you're fed up. And you say, forget the one league plan. And you'd always been a one league guy, but you say enough is enough. And yet by June of 79, Quebec, Winnipeg, Edmonton, and Hartford are absorbed by the NHL. So what changed?
Here's what happened. It wasn't March. It was December of 78. And we had the plan of expansion. We had it all worked out. John Ziegler and his committee and myself and our committee were the 3 teams that got in. And they had the annual meeting like they did in those days down in Florida at the Breakers. John said, we're going to vote and get ready to come down so we can announce it. And I had the head of Aetna and the corporate jet. We were all set to leave at 8 the next morning. And I get the call at 8 the next morning and said, you're not going to believe it. And John was almost in tears. He said, you're not going to believe it, but the Hawks did their thing with Vancouver and Montreal, totally turning on we knew there were 3 votes we'd never get. Boston. Let me get it right now. We knew we'd never get Toronto. We knew we'd never get Boston. There was one other team that wasn't going to vote for it, but we thought we had Vancouver, Frank Griffith, and Montreal, Morgan McCammon. Well, they flipped the switch. And I may be a little wrong on the other 3, but I don't think so. And so that's when we had the press conference, and we're really mad. We said, okay, this is what they want. This is what they're going to get. And we're through, so, kind of like threw down the gauntlet because we were mad. Edmonton, when the franchises were mad. Well, it was that night that John Ziegler called me and said, can you get your guys back to the table? Because the fans in Winnipeg, literally drove down near the offices of the Molson's Brewery in Winnipeg, and they fired rifle shots, pistol shot through the window of the brewery. And the guy that voted for the ownership voted not the way his owners wanted. He got fired. And so I said, John, I think we could hold them together. Well, of course, I knew I could hold them together. And then I got a call from the head of Molson's, Morgan McCammon. And he said, I really need you on this one. Maybe you could fly up here, meet with me, and we can tell you how much we support it. Because he was scared too, because he made the wrong decision for his company. He got caught up in the hockey war instead of the what's good business war, if you follow what I mean. And I'm sure you do. So then we got it done.
So the team gets rebranded in the NHL as the Hartford Whalers, and along with it, one of the best logo designs ever. And I don't mean in hockey, and I don't mean in sports. I mean one of the best logo designs, period. And you had a big part in making that happen. Tell us.
Well, I'm going to tell you, the credit to that logo goes to the designer, Peter Good, and our marketing head, Bill Barnes. And they worked hard on it, and they came to me and said, no, this is what we think is good. I mean, I really had, other than to say, at least the fact I got the fact you had a hell of a logo there.
Well, you also saw the H.
Yeah. We saw the H, you got that. And, it just was an icon. It still is, as you said, and I appreciate you saying that, an iconic logo. But I really want credit to go where it should go. And Barnesy and the designer, the artist, get the credit. But it still sells a lot of merchandise in the NHL.
Since you mentioned Toronto's notorious owner, Harold Ballard, he was, it's well known, a fierce competitor of the 79 expansion. He attended the Whalers' first home game when they hosted the Leafs. He showed up, and you said at the time, quote, if I knew he was coming, I would have taken him to dinner. Really?
Oh, yeah, sure. But he was a character. And
you're being kind. You're being kind.
What's he gonna? He ain't gonna beat me up. I promise you that. And he was what he was. He was like a cartoon character. And when we played our first game in Toronto, I said to Jack Kelly, we're gonna go and watch this. And they, when you're the visiting owner or staff, they have seats for you. They didn't have boxes in those days. So we sat in the stands in the corner, but I looked behind me and there's like a bunker, where you would shoot a machine gun out of. And that's where Harold Ballard and the little old fella, I forget his name, King Clancy.
Right.
They would watch the game. Okay. Now he had been on record as saying Dave Keon was finished, and Gordie Howe was a bum, and he called me a mackerel snapper from Rhode Island or something. I don't know what the hell he meant. But anyway, we win the game 3-1. Gordie got 2 goals. Keon got 1. At the end of the game, I look up at that little box, and you could just see the top of his head, and I could see all the fans just yelling, screaming at him and calling him every name under the book. I just figured, well, payback's a bitch, Harold.
Well, for the record, when the Whalers played and hosted the Leafs, you won that game too. But I want to mention that game was played in the Whalers' temporary home, Springfield, Massachusetts. And so you said something I want you to reflect on in 1980 about the prior 3 years. We've had a roof collapse, a new building open up, a merger, and our first year in the NHL. I mean, Six Flags never had a roller coaster that wild.
It was wild, when you look back on it, with the roof collapse, and I was in Quebec. I got word first thing in the morning. And by the time I got back to Hartford that night, we had the dates all lined up in Springfield. Great credit to Barnes and Davey Andrews, the people that worked for me. So we never missed a beat. We were concerned, the league was concerned, because they knew if the Whalers folded or stopped playing, the league was in real trouble. And we never missed a beat. I mean, it was the Hartford situation, Glenn, was a perfect storm, as I call it, of corporate community coming together with the business community, coming together with the city, the state, and creating an environment that's perfect for a team to succeed. And that's what it was. Simple as that.
When I talked to John Forsland, who was your PR and media director, later broadcaster, he mentioned that the Whalers were really a model franchise in terms of interacting with the community. Do you recall it that way?
Yeah. We made a huge push in community relations. We did 300 or 400 events a year. And it was the smartest thing we did, because after the 79-80 year, in that first year in the, excuse me, in the NHL, we made the playoffs. Then we went 4 years where we were bad. And we never dropped below 73% paid capacity. And the reason was plain and simple. We became a fixture in that community. Went to events, participated in anything and everything we could. And so we were really like, we were just a community-owned team, even though the community didn't own us, they did.
In 87, you fully come out of the doldrums. The Whalers win their first and only division title. What are your memories of that year?
Really, the 85-86 year for me was way more exciting. First of all, I met my wife, Karen. Okay, you saw her on the Zoom one day, I think. She was working for All-Star. It was a big All-Star game in Hartford. And we actually, when the game was played in February, as I recall, end of Jan, like first, second week of February, we were again struggling to make the playoffs. And then after that All-Star game, it just, everything turned around and we made the playoffs, and it was like everybody was so excited. And then we beat Quebec in the first round, and we won 7 games against Montreal in the first round. They actually had a parade in the city. Claude Leroux's wife said, he had like 9 Stanley Cups in Montreal. He said, I've never known a team to have or city to have a parade for a team that lost in the second round of the playoffs. The next year, we just followed it right up with the division championship and didn't do as well in the playoffs. But for me, of the NHL years, that 85-86 was the best one for me.
Sports is weird, isn't it? You finish 4th in the division, you barely squeak into the playoffs. Then you have that magical upset. The next year you win the damn division, and then you get knocked out in the first round.
That's right. Harry Neal, who came to coach us when we were in the WHL, love Harry. And we had not a good season. Okay. He came in, I think, like in the middle of the year. It wasn't his fault. We caught fire in the playoffs. I think we made the finals. And then we lost. And I remember waking up about a week after, and there was a column in the Hartford Current quoting Harry and saying, I hope Howard realizes the regular season doesn't lie. And in playoffs, you can catch lightning in a bottle one way or the other.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you've seen it happen in all your years. And I've seen it happen, not just in hockey, but in baseball, or really doesn't happen in football because it's just a one-off, but you know what I mean.
Was the Whalers executive committee part of the reason you ceded control in 1988?
No, not at all. Let me give you in 1988, the corporate community came to me and said, Howard, we think we have done the job here. We're making money. And we never, it's not in our portfolio or whatever you call those business models for these insurance companies and United Technologies and the whole hockey team. They felt their corporate conscience were clear. And they said, we want you to find us a buyer. Now, I was very consistent with them. I said, of course I will, but I urge you not to sell the whole team. I urge you not to lose control of franchise movement. You just never want to lose that control. And they didn't listen. That's the only area where I was upset with them, because they figured, okay, Conrad and Gordon are going to buy the team. It's theirs to do with whatever they think is right or wrong. And it was a huge error, because you know what happened. Individuals don't have the same corporate conscience that the corporate community did. And within 10 years, the team was gone. And then it was a great crime.
Which leads me to my last question. You're a Hollywood mogul, and so I'm going to use the word zeitgeist. And the Hartford Whalers somehow have remained in the zeitgeist. And how much does that surprise you?
Well, I'm not sure what zeitgeist is, okay?
Okay,
but
let's just say it's in the public consciousness. You're still seeing starlets wearing Whalers T-shirts and the team in Carolina, which I think is an obscene thing, but they decided to wear the Whalers sweaters, and the merchandise sales are still ridiculous. It's the biggest selling merchandise team for a defunct team. It's bigger than the Brooklyn Dodgers, for goodness sake.
Yeah, and it's so nice to hear you say that. And that is true. And it's because I think it's because it was truly a community team. And that was the culture of all of us. The corporate community they were wonderful owners, and they made the mistake at the end. But that franchise, when the roof collapsed, they never batted an eye. They were right there with the backing. And when we did the merger, they were right there with the backing. So, and the fans never dropped. When we went to Springfield, they all followed us up there, or most of them did. So it became part of the fabric of the community. And when you become the fabric of a community, you're going to succeed. Saddest thing in the world was them ever letting that team leave. It never should have happened. The governor should never have let it happen. The corporate community should never have let it happen. But you didn't have the leadership then. That was the problem. And the owner of the team didn't really want to keep it there.
When you think of Hartford Whalers today, when somebody mentions those two words, is there a particular game or individual or event that pops to mind first?
Gee whiz. Not necessarily. I mean, the two great years were the first year and the 85-86 year. And really going to the seventh game in Montreal. Those were the two most significant moments on the ice. But when I think of the Whalers, I think of what I told you about everyone coming together to make something work. And in a small community like that, that's the only way it can work. Only way it can work is everybody coming together. And they let go of that. And they forgot that. And now they don't have a team. And it's a crime, because the people there deserve a team. It's a beautiful community. Lots of wonderful people. They deserve a team. But in order to get that, you got to bring together what we had in the early 70s when we moved the team there. And you got to keep it like that. And then it'll be the greatest gift, as Randy Quaid said in Christmas Vacation, It's the gift that keeps on giving every year. And that's what it should be. The team should be that.
Howard, Owen Canfield wrote this about you in the Hartford Courant when you stepped aside as managing general partner of the Whalers. Quote, Baldwin did 1,000 things that smaller, envious men wish they had the brains and the nerve to try. Not a bad send-off.
Nah, he was a great guy. Not just because he said that. He was just a great lover of sports. And who's kidding who? Being involved in sports, or it's most people's fantasy. I mean, who doesn't read the sports page? And so to be able to get involved and do the kind of things we did, well, it was a privilege.
Howard, the privilege was entirely ours that you spent more than a half hour with us today talking. We can't thank you enough. We really appreciate it.
I love being with you, Glenn. You stay there. Stay well, will you? Stay in touch with me.
Our great thanks one more time to Mark Howe, Pat Pickens, Chuck Caton, and to Howard Baldwin. Instead of our usual so longs, we'll leave the goodbyes to Kevin Dineen on the occasion of the last game in Hartford Whalers history, April 13th, 1997.
It's been my pleasure to be associated with you, the fans, for your support and the enthusiasm you show in this building. There's none other. And on behalf of all the players that have left Hartford and the guys that are sitting on this bench, we just want to say thank you from all of us. God bless, and thank you very much.